And we're off. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on Variant Roles for our last Pride Brunch of the season. So happy that you're all here. My name's Eugenio. I use he, him pronouns, and I am honored to be following up in the footsteps of MK Hansen and Matthew Foreman, hosting today's Pride Brunch. Let's go around really quickly before we get too deep into anything and introduce everybody that's here today. Let's go around clockwise. So we'll move to Sarah first.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I use she, her pronouns, and I am completely new to this. I got in by a mutual friend.
Yes, and we're so happy to have you. We have already indoctrinated her into the Discord for variant roles, and our claws are in her. She's not getting away now. It's gonna be great. I'm super excited to have you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Of course,
Happy
Colin.
to be here.
Colin.
Hi, I'm Colin. I use him pronouns, and I am very happy to get on one of these Pride brunches. I was trying to get into an early one, but the schedule didn't match up, and
Yeah.
I think this is going to be a good one. So,
Yeah, I'm excited about it. And last but most certainly not least, Corey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Corey. My pronouns are he, they. I'm super excited to be back for a Pride brunch. I've got my tea with me. I'm good to go. And I'm really excited.
What leaf are we drinking today, Corey?
I have a black tea that I added some condensed milk to make it a milk tea.
Oh, delightful. Delightful.
Mhm.
All right. Well, that's the four of us. Once again, I'm Eugenio, he, him pronouns. You may have seen me around as DM Jazzy Hands. That's me. So today, so as many of you probably know, I'm in New York. I know at least one of our other panelists is also in New York. And tomorrow is the Pride March here in New York City. Yesterday was the official 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which we're going to be talking about today. Our theme for today's Pride Brunch is going to be the history of Stonewall, the history of Pride, where we came from, where we are today, how we got here, and sort of all of our experiences with that history. Before we start, though, just a couple of housekeeping things here about Variant Roles. You're all here, so you probably know who we are and what we do, but thank you for joining us. We stream all kinds of RPG content on a weekly basis. We have community games, we have long-running campaign streams. We use all kinds of different systems, D&D 5th Edition, Cypher system, all kinds of different things from Money Cook Games. We've got some Fate Core games going on. So if you aren't already, click the little heart at the top of the screen to follow the channel. We would super appreciate that. This month, and we've only got, today and tomorrow left in the month, but for Pride, we are raising all of our bits and any other tips and donations you all would like to contribute are going to go to Trans Lifeline, a really amazing organization that we are super happy to be supporting this month. We've done super well so far, and we would like to sort of end our fundraising push with a bang. So anything that you're able to give, or even if you aren't in a position to be able to give money, which we completely understand and is absolutely fine, even a signal boost, a retweet, something to help us get more folks here that maybe can put some money towards Trans Lifeline would be hugely appreciated. There's a link just below the video screen here where you can donate if you would like to use that, or like I said, any bits and things like that that we get during the stream will go towards that. Corey has helpfully put a link to the organization in the chat. So have a look at that. They're an amazing organization. We're very happy to be supporting them this month. All right, I think that takes care of the housekeeping type stuff that we have to do. So let's jump in. So like I said, for those of us who are in New York, tomorrow is our Pride celebration. Why don't we all sort of talk about? I think the first thing that we wanted to sort of jump in on was sort of what we all remember as our first Pride experiences. Yeah, does anyone want to tell us a story? Oh my god, you guys not all at once. They won't be able to understand what people are saying, and we don't want to miss anything. Corey, do you want to start us off?
Yes,
okay.
I can jump in.
Okay, great.
So my first Pride was 3 years ago, I think, and then before that, a few years was actually coming out, and before then, it was kind of interesting because I definitely did not understand the full breadth of like queer history, and I still don't. Still learning about it. But when I went to my first Pride, I actually had a work event that was beforehand. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll go to my work thing, go check out Pride later if I've got some time. I was just like curious to go see what it was all about. Um, my work thing ended up going late. So for the most part, I got there and it was like, cool, it's all over. This is kind of awkward, but it's nice to be here and check it out. Um, and that gave me the motivation next year to actually like commit to going, make a plan out of it. And over that time, I was beginning to learn a bit about the importance for me of my connection to the queer community. And so that's sort of my first pride, and the things that I think about it is, you know, learning about that importance and then getting to a point where it's like, yeah, I want to go to this. I want to see what's going on. I want to learn about it, learn more. And then I went the next year and it was pretty awesome.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Does anyone else want to tell us about your first Pride experience?
Not necessarily my first
Sure.
Pride, because I had gone to Pride adjacent events back when I was living in Maryland. But when I went up to Boston for school, I was working at a bar that is right on Boylston Street, which is where the Pride went through, and one of our biggest days of the year. So there was always competition amongst the bartenders and barbacks to be on the line during the march and afterwards. But that was actually because I come from relatively like a private Catholic education previous to that. It was the first time that I was like right there at the Pride parade and seeing not just the parade itself, not just the sort of public event, but the different smaller, more intimate meetings of friends and family celebrating Pride by having a meal together, or getting wasted at our bar.
Tomato.
Yeah, and there was always a really good contrast between the more public Pride parade and event, and then the night we were always rented out by Lesbian Nightlife in Boston, and it was all bets are off. It was the craziest we'd get. Even marathon day wasn't as big and as wild as when the lesbians took over our bar.
Wow. Awesome. Sarah, you have a story for us?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat of a newcomer to the queer community. My first Pride was actually last year, back in Buffalo. And it was eye-opening because there's, before that, I hadn't really like seen the queer community, capital C, capital Q, capital C. And so seeing, the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who I'm sure there were some cishet allies in there too, but still, that's more people than in flags and fun clothes. It was really nice to see. So
excellent.
That's my story. I didn't do anything super crazy.
No, that's okay because you don't have to. We can all do Pride in our own way. Yeah, mine actually, similar to Corey, my first Pride was probably about 3 years ago that I really attended. A Pride adjacent event, sure, I had been to before, but 3 years ago, New York Pride was really my first time attending the day of festivities. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of marching in the Pride Parade here in New York City with Actors Equity Association, the Union of Professional Actors and Stage Managers here in the States. And last year, I don't remember where I was, but I've also been lucky enough to be able to attend Pride in some other cities around the country, which has been really great. Let's go around really quick, because I'm curious. We all sort of have some similarities in our stories about what our experience of Pride was, particularly the first time. So I'm curious, in like 1 to 3 words, and it can be a phrase or just like 3 different words or however you want to do it, but in 1 to 3 words, let's have everybody sort of tell us what your conception and your perception of that first Pride was. And later, once we sort of talked about the history and where we've all gotten to, I'm going to ask you again that question, but what your perception of Pride now is. But let's start with what it was that first time. We'll go in the same order. So, Corey, when you're ready, but take your time. I can vamp if I need to, because I also have to think about what mine are.
My words to describe my first perception. I think I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just rainbows.
Sure. Totally. Yeah.
There's just a lot of rainbows. I think I would, thinking about it a bit more, I'd say lots of people.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. Rainbows and lots of people. I love it. Colin?
Anxiety, comfort, and joy.
I love that.
Uh,
I love that.
Especially, I thinking now, I'm not sure I was out to my coworkers at the time, and so there was that like tremulous edge to my excitement for it. It was like both anxious and comforting at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, mine are going to be similar, but first let's go to Sarah.
So anxiety was a big one for me just because I'm also kind of an introvert and like, you know, never been to something that big before, but there was a lot of diversity there. So that was nice to see. It's really the first time I'd seen anything along such a wide spectrum.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, mine also, I think anxiety is a good word for my first experience. Also, I think one of my sort of descriptors for the first one that I attended was over the top. And we're going to talk a lot about this today, or some about this at least today. I didn't really understand why. And because I'd been out for a while when I went to my first Pride 3 years ago, but I hadn't really found my way in to engage with the queer community and to be sort of out and proud in a very visible way. And so I didn't understand the sort of over-the-topness and that type of energy at Pride that first year. Yeah.
I would definitely add to that I had a similar feeling where I would have like for sure labeled myself as very uninformed on much of it.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Cool. So that was sort of where we all came from in terms of our relationship with Pride. And it is a great segue talking about not sort of being uninformed and not knowing a lot of where it came from, to talk about where it came from and to inform ourselves and our lovely viewers about where it came from. So there's a lot of talk this year about World Pride and the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And I'm actually curious, for those of you who don't live in New York, because Stonewall is here in my city, and so I'm actually curious, what is sort of the balance between the advertising for World Pride and the advertising for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall? Is that a thing outside of New York that has been sort of capitalized on a ton? Outside of New York City, I should say.
Here, I don't know that it is. I don't think there's a huge separation of the two. It's sort of, in fact, I hadn't even realized it was 50th anniversary until like midway through the month when the actual Pride events were coming up.
Cool. Okay. I mean, not so cool, but yes. Okay, great.
I've seen quite a bit of trying this year in particular to highlight Stonewall and coming back to that within my communities, I think. Don't know if it's enough.
Sure.
But I've been seeing a lot more of it.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So here in Southern Tier, New York, it's almost, there's been almost no mention of Stonewall whatsoever. There was like a history type thing at the Corning Pride, which was their first one. So maybe that's why. But
Sure.
that was about it.
Interesting. Okay. Well, great. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of important queer history surrounding Pride and the Pride marches and all of the events that we do. But we talk about, for those of you who don't know, who are watching, for those of you who don't know, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and the very first Pride march in 1970 was on what was called Christopher Street Liberation Day. Which commemorated these riots that happened outside of an ostensibly queer bar, sort of, kind of, in the Village in New York City a year before, on June 28th, 1969. And that's why you see, again, I'm not sure how much of this has sort of made it into the mainstream, but I have seen a lot of posts about, remember that the first Pride was a protest, remember that the first Pride was a riot, remember that the first Pride was a march, not a parade, right? And that's what it's talking about, was the commemoration of this day in 1969 that really kicked off, in a lot of ways, sort of the major mainstream queer rights movement initiatives in the United States and ultimately then around the world. So let's talk a little bit then, let's jump in and talk a little bit about the history of Stonewall. Does anyone want to sort of give us the opening background? I know, Corey, you and I sort of, being the organized humans that we are, wrote up a bullet-pointed outline to talk about things. So
I think it'd be interesting to maybe start off with mentioning like what the bar was. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
some of the context around there, like things involving like the mafia and all that kind of stuff. Because when I learned about that, I was like, this is crazy. This is insane.
Yeah. So that's sort of why I said ostensibly a queer bar. So it was not exactly legal, right, to be a gay bar in New York City in 1969. So what sort of happened was that, and this was true of a lot of sort of underground communities in New York at the time. What would happen is bars that were controlled by, like Corey said, the mafia, would serve as places where those communities, and in this case where the queer community, could gather in relative safety. The mafia would, with their sort of control over the police and over a lot of city government administration, they would bribe city officials and police officers into sort of, at best, not raiding the establishments, and at the very least, at least giving them a heads up when raids were going to happen. Because raids did happen quite a bit. Police would raid establishments that were rumored to be queer bars and things like that, and would arrest folks, I should mention, as we talk about this history, I have no intention of getting into sort of the gory details about anything, but I should mention for our viewers and listeners and however you're consuming this content, that there are going to be some things that we talk about, including the police and including their treatment of, in particular, trans women and drag queens from that time that I could see being upsetting to some folks. So, we're going to touch on that as lightly as possible, but I do think it's an important part of the history. Please, if you feel like we are doing too much, I don't want anyone to feel like they can't watch the stream. So, be in touch with us here in the chat. We're all watching. So stuff goes a little too far, let us know. We'll do our best to sort of pull it back, but I think some of it's important. So anyway, what I was saying was, police would raid, they would arrest folks, they would take trans women and drag queens and have female police officers do gender checks in the bathrooms, things like that. And so what the mafia was able to do was that, like I said, they would get heads up on raids. And the Stonewall Inn was one of these places that was mafia controlled, and so generally sort of didn't really have to worry too much. If there was going to be a raid, the place was pretty empty for that night. And then, money would be paid, booze would be exchanged, and things could sort of go about the next night. That isn't, however, what happened on the night of Saturday, June 28th, 1969.
Something that I thought I could maybe interject with is, I thought it was interesting how with the mafia, I don't think it wasn't the healthiest relationship between the mafia and the queer community, right? It was almost like, I think you can almost draw parallels between that and how a lot of corporations now are trying to use a community for their own gains, which, is shitty, but there was that happening. It was, I think, as I understand it, some ways the mafia could use that as a way to have more control, get more money, and it was almost a business decision in some regards like that. And yeah, I think that draws interesting parallels to what we see a little bit today, just in a more capitalist focused.
Sure. It's somewhat less illegal today. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
more. I think it's more than a little, the parallels, right?
Yes.
And I think it is a through line in queer history that we have been forced in a lot of ways to take help where we can get it, and sometimes that is not where we wish we could get it from. But the Mafia allowed us to have queer spaces. Despite, like you said, the unhealthiness of the relationship. Corporations being in on Pride make Pride more visible to a lot more people, despite the fact that, like, it sure would be nice if they remembered us the other 11 months of the year. Colin and Sarah, do you guys, like, this is something that I have a feeling we're going to come back to a lot as we talk about the importance of the history of Pride, because it ties in directly with sort of where Pride is now. But do you all have any thoughts about sort of those parallels, or how we feel about having to use and take help where we can get it?
Yes.
Strap in, ladies and gentlemen, and our non-binary friends. Here we go.
One of the things that in preparation for today's talk, I was reading a lot about those, and you've mentioned the like threads, the through lines, and they're things that we absolutely need to keep in mind going forward in the various struggles and things that we still have. As Corey mentioned, like they'd have these female officers do gender checks in the bathroom. And what stuck in my mind is the bathroom controversy with trans folk, right? One of the things people were saying were, what are they going to do? Like, check people's gender in the bathroom? It's like, well, they did. They did. And if we forget the lengths that they've already gone, if we just accept that we have moved forward, maybe we haven't, right? This can happen again because it already happened.
Sure.
And there is, like, I don't know how political we want to get here, but there is.
Go for it. If we need to tone it down,
Pride
I will.
is
But
political.
something tells me it's going to be a pretty high bar today. So go for it.
Yeah. So here in the U.S., the backslide is concerning, to say the least. And I think it does kind of tie into this whole corporations at Pride thing, which I know was a huge point of contention over this past month, because on one hand, you know, there is the point that it lends us visibility, and it is in and of itself, you know, a thing to say, like, oh, look, corporations have decided that the LGBT community is worth pandering to, which speaks to our social acceptance, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, they'll turn around and they'll donate to Republicans who want to enact bathroom bills and repeal gay marriage and, you know, do all this other horrible stuff. So the feeling of exploitation is, you know, but be it by the Mafia or by capitalism generally, is definitely a through line that I think people need to be a bit more aware of and question, as opposed to just saying, oh, look, you know, Giant Bank has a rainbow flag this month. Let's yay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Colin.
There's a writer, Terry Eagleton. He's a pretty socialist, post-Marxist writer. But one of the things he writes about is the idea that we are very much in danger of hegemony. In this case, he talked about capitalist hegemonies, anticipating and subsuming their own resistance. The emblematic version of that is selling Che Guevara t-shirts, right?
Get me started. That's a whole other brunch.
Right, and I think what Sarah is like absolutely on par. Like that is the sort of line we have to toe, because at what point is accepting these less than genuine helping hands simply allowing the hegemony to anticipate and subsume its own resistance?
Yeah. Well, and I think, Sarah, you brought up a really interesting and sort of particular point for this moment. You know, queer bar's relationship with the Mafia in the 60s and 70s was not healthy in a lot of ways. But I think there is sort of a whole other level of the problematic relationship with Pride and corporations now, because of exactly what you said, right? The Mafia may have made money off of us, and weren't generally law-abiding or awesome human beings. But I don't, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I could not speak to the deep history of the mafia in New York City in the 1960s, but I don't think they were necessarily sort of also on the other side actively working against the queer community. They were there to make money, so they made money, right? Corporations, like you talk about, like there is I don't know, to me there is another level of a corporation that puts up queer flags and donates to, Lindsey Graham's re-election campaign, right? And that's happening, and that to me is a whole other level, and like you said, something that we definitely should be aware of. This is an awesome topic, but I really want to talk about what actually happened on the night in 1969. So I'm gonna sort of put a pin in where we are right now, and get back to Stonewall 1969 for just a minute. Corey, was there anything else that we wanted to talk about in terms of like the setting or the setup for that night?
Oh, I had one small thing.
Please.
What was the condition of Stonewall? Was it a nice bar? Was it a seedy bar?
Yeah, no, it was a pretty, I mean, I think we would call it a dive, right? It wasn't a hole in the wall. It wasn't necessarily an imminently dangerous place to be inside of, but it was certainly not, the bar at the plaza by any means. And that I think sort of spoke to the clientele, right? They felt safe in a place that wouldn't attract a lot of attention. In addition to, obviously the mafia's protections, it felt safer to be in a darker hole than to be in a place that was going to, attract the passing by tourist, right? Although I'm not sure there were any tourists hanging around the village in 1969, but anyway, how things have changed. So it's a good point. It was not on the top 10 list of bars to visit in 1969 in New York City. So that night, about 1 a.m., there were about 200 people at the Stonewall Inn at the time, and there's a lot of sort of conflicting, or at least not exactly lining up stories about exactly how it happened. But the long and short of it is that for whatever reason, the bar staff that night was not tipped off to a police raid. So at about 1 a.m., police busted in, and this was, I venture to say that at least a majority of the folks in the bar that night had probably experienced, either themselves or through one degree of separation, a police raid in a queer bar, right? And the way it sort of worked was you were taken outside and lined up. If you were male presenting, I shouldn't even say that. You were asked to see your ID, and then those particularly trans women and drag queens, although I do believe it also happened to drag kings and trans men, were taken into the bathroom by police officers and their genders were checked. And then, from there, it sort of depended on the whim of the police officers doing the raid, whether folks were arrested, whether you were fined, whether you were let go, what exactly happened next. And so that's sort of how things started that night. It was a shitty situation, but not terribly uncommon, until some trans women and drag queens decided to refuse the gender checks in the bathroom. And so that sort of sparked more folks to refuse to go with those police officers, which sparked more folks to refuse to show their IDs, which began to rile folks up. And this was sort of, in any sort of significant way, was the first time that a raid resulted in folks saying, actually, no, we're not doing anything wrong, and we will not cooperate with this treatment. The bar was cleared out. People gathered. It did attract attention. The village might not have been a hotspot for tourists, but there were certainly lots of people around. It was a Saturday night in June, so folks were out, and a crowd started to gather. People started singing. Some of the patrons of the bar started a kick line and sort of parody lyrics of popular songs at the time, which I shan't repeat here, but are quite funny if you want to Google it or look at the Wikipedia article or check out some documentary. In general, it was definitely largely nonviolent on the part of the patrons at first. It was somewhat good-natured. It was sort of, this is ridiculous. Why is this happening? The kick line was it was all sort of taunting the police in a very non-physical way. And then, of course, as things are wont to do in situations like this, things got physical, things got violent. A woman, there is some debate about exactly who it was, although most reports attribute this woman as being I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, Storm de Larviere? God, I'm terrible at French. She was a well-known lesbian in the community at the time, so there are reports that she was the one who was grabbed by the police, hit on the head, some reports say with a billy club, taken, put in the paddy wagon, and arrested. And that's sort of when things began to get a little bit more out of control. Some folks were yelling that the mafia hadn't paid off the police this month. That's why they weren't alerted. And so there were cries of, well, let's pay them off now. So coins began to be thrown at police officers. Coins escalated to beer cans, stones, bricks. Garbage was set on fire. Things got generally more heated. There were sort of obviously there were leaders of the patrons and that were sort of kicking things off in this sort of very like I said, a new way. This was not the result of any of the raids thus far that the police had experienced. And then some prominent figures in the queer community at the time who hadn't necessarily been at the bar that night began to show up and continue to sort of lead things for the queer community. People like Marsha P. Johnson, people like Sylvia Rivera, Zazu Nova. You will notice that all of these names belong to drag queens and trans women, and actually all three of those folks that I just named are trans women of color. And yeah, somebody pick up the thread, because I've sort of need a moment.
One thing I was that would be interesting to mention is if there wasn't any plans that I know of to like rebel. There wasn't, an agreement like, oh, if this happens, we're going to fight back. It was sort of like the last straw that broke the camel's back for a whole community. And it was pushing and pushing and pushing. And there was a collective push back that really, was, I think, just a sign of how much this had been going on, and how at the time, everyone just sort of began to agree and realize like it's time to stop and say no, not anymore.
Yeah, the riot itself, right, it's well established how spontaneous it was, how there was no planning. It's also one of those threads that bears like keeping in mind is the sheer diversity of the groups that came together. Prior to Stonewall, you have homophile groups, you have transvestite groups, you have lesbian groups, and all these different sort of isolated advocacies. And there were certainly moments of resistance that preceded Stonewall. Stonewall was not the only time that the queers fought back, but it does seem to be this confluence of these different groups. You have queers of color, you have drag queens, you have trans women, you have trans men, you have lesbians, cross-dressers, you have sex workers, you have the street queens is what they call themselves.
Yes.
And all of them, they were all there, right? And every one of them was throwing something at the pigs. So remembering that this wasn't limited to a single advocacy group, that it really did take all of them coming to a unconscious consensus that this was unacceptable. That's a strong moment.
Yeah, and so we see this riot happen. We see, we see folks getting arrested. There's a lot of confusion on the part of the police. It takes a long time for a second paddy wagon to arrive, which sort of escalates things in some weird ways. The specifics of the history are really interesting, and there's a lot of really great documentaries out there that you can watch for the specifics. But what I sort of want to mention next as we go through this little mini history lesson is how it ended, which considering everything that we've said and what Colin just brought up about how this really was sort of the popping of a cork in a lot of ways, and it was a confluence of all of these different groups sort of finally in a big way saying this is enough. No one died. Ultimately, only 13 people were arrested. There were injuries on both sides, but nothing ultimately life-threatening or extremely serious, which is hard for me to sort of wrap my mind around, which I think says a lot about sort of where we are now with these sorts of demonstrations and things like that. We've seen a lot of horrible things and horrible results from protests and demonstrations and riots in the last 5-10 years. But this one, that's how it ended. At about 4 a.m., finally everyone had sort of dispersed. Like I said, 13 people were arrested. Some folks were injured in, minor to moderate ways. And that was sort of it. The next night, it happened again. Folks reconvened at the Stonewall. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson and Zazu Nova were all there again that night. Very similar things happened, lasted again until about 4 a.m. And again, very few arrests, no fatalities, no serious injuries. And from that moment on, the community felt that something had changed for all the reasons that we've said. It became very quickly a very public affair. It was covered in the Village Voice. It was covered in other newspapers. And organizations began to feel that they had some firm footing that they could finally stand on. The Gay Liberation Front formed in New York within months. Other organizations began to form within a year. By June 28, 1970, the day was probably informally named Christopher Street Liberation Day, and there were marches. There were permitted, city sanctioned in its way, I guess, kind of marches on that day. This was because of the publicity, because of the folks that were there, because of the folks that covered it. This became the flashpoint that began a lot of queer rights movements, and we have made a lot of progress. There are a lot of organizations. We see a lot of things. Things have changed. We also haven't made a lot of progress. That's a whole other point that we can talk about. But, we cannot overstate the importance and the value of what these individuals did. And too many people don't know those names that I keep saying. Too many people don't know who they were. Too many people... this is also, I will say, and again, this might be a New York City thing, but I will say that the images of Pride and the people who are a part of Pride have improved in the last year or two. But when I was growing up, Pride was pictures of cis white gay men, and those people were present on June 28th, 1969, but they were not the majority. They were not the figures that we talk about today as being the leaders of this movement. And too many people don't know that. Don't know, and I'm going to say their names again. I'm going to leave Storms for last because I'm going to mangle it once again. But Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Zazu Nova, Storm de Laverie, and other names that I could list for the remainder of our time together. These people that night are the reason that we have these parades, these marches, these whatever you want to call them. I tend to prefer to call them marches today. And we have sort of as a community at large lost sight of that, which is why I wanted to do this topic today. I think everything that all four of us have said about the problematic aspects of Pride today, whether it's the corporate presence at Pride, whether it's the police presence at Pride, whether it's the sort of general capitalism of Pride, the more we can educate and remember where Pride started and why it started, that to me is that education to me is our way into making Pride what it is meant to be, and to returning it to what it was meant to be, which is, yes, a joyful celebration that we can be who we are in public, but it is also a remembrance of what we had to fight and who did that fighting for us. Steps off soapbox, allows someone else to talk. Anybody, please. Yeah.
I need a second to think.
Yeah,
No
well,
worries.
and I'll try and if somebody has something, if not, I can try and guide it, which is just to say, so let's talk about like what that moment was. We have a lot of context for that moment now, 50 years later, but let's let's sort of think about
Yeah.
what that moment must have been 50 years ago, and how we, as the people who have benefited from it and from everything that came from it, can try and understand what that must have been like.
So you, when you were describing it, which you did very well, by the way, it's very easy to follow as someone who is only reading about the particularities of this moment in the last couple of days. But one thing that stuck out is when you mentioned it spiraling out of control,
Mhm.
and in many senses, that's right. But I think there is also a sense that it didn't spiral out of control. It changed who was in control.
Sure.
Right, the police show up and they're lining people up, and the fact that there were such a low degree of sort of human cost to it, injuries, not death, the remarkably few arrests, and then they came back and did it the next night to the same effect. I think that really speaks to this was not, as many riots and direct actions and things are often cast to be. This was not a population going primal and losing control and going wild.
Right.
It was absolutely pointed and purposeful. And again, um, to suggest that the Stonewall riots were thoughtless and wild, the chorus line disagrees.
Literally, the chorus line of high kicking queens that were, like you said, the ones who decided to take control of the situation. Absolutely.
I think it's also important to think about how like brave and courageous you would have to be in that time to push forward with that, like to be within the queer community, which has faced a lot of things, especially at a time where laws and policies and public perception was not in its favor, to like actually stand up and risk whatever your physical safety in that situation, not knowing what the outcome would be. I think is really important, because it could have been a lot different. And before before it actually happened, you don't know what the results are going to be. So that uncertainty, I think, just thinking to that moment, sort of gives me even much more respect for the people that were able to put together and fight and stand up.
It gives me hope, honestly, that they did it and we can too.
Sure.
That whatever they had, whatever spark and fire, it's not gone.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about who they were, but Sarah, I want to get your take on stuff first.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to spin off that a little bit, because I think one of the big reasons we want to be aware of the history of Pride and what happened at Stonewall is because, and I will admit I'm a little biased on this. I'm an attorney by trade, so the way I see a lot of queer activism kind of playing out these days is very law policy focused, right? Like there's this huge push, until 2015, where the big thing is marriage equality. And now, it's the Equal Rights Act and bathroom bills and stuff like that. And not to say that that's not important, because it is.
Sure.
But it's not the only thing. There's, the people can, I'm going to start over.
Yeah.
The courts are not the be all end all of, social power. People can still stand up themselves and say, this is wrong. And, we're not going to just go along with it, even if it's in a way that's not your typical riot where it's, violent and animalistic and out of control.
Yeah.
But it is still important to not just go along when laws are unjust, which given, again, the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, the legal gains that the queer community has made in the past few years are very much at peril now.
Yeah.
And I think, especially going forward, we need to remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I have two things that I want to talk about. Okay, so we're gonna. Yes, that is super important. I want to talk about that in just a minute. I want to come back to something that Colin said, which was that these people that were there that night in '69, they had something, and we can have it too. It's also worth noting. We've talked about who they were in terms of the fact that there were a lot of queers of color. There was a lot of trans women that were a part of this. The other thing is that they were children, y'all. They were kids. They, not maybe legally, but they were, I mean, the vast majority of them were under 30. I would venture to say that the vast majority of them, maybe not the vast majority, but a large percentage of them were probably under 25. They were children who had nothing to lose in a lot of ways. And there have been, something I discovered as I was sort of getting ready for this is this, I couldn't believe it when I read it, this like insanely reductive and offensive theory that I think doesn't get a lot of play anymore, but that the Stonewall riots were somehow directly related to the fact that Judy Garland had passed away earlier in the week that week. And so like the queers were ready for something. It's insanity. But one of the sort of articles that I read about that had somebody who was there that night saying, you know what? Like, yes, like that was a sad moment, whatever. Like, sure, she was a queer icon in her way at the time, but like she was a queer icon for white middle-aged men, right? These were kids. These were trans people. These were people of color. They didn't care. Not like that, right? They didn't have a whole lot to lose. They had everything to gain. And they had that amazing thing that we have seen younger and younger people in the United States in particular lately doing, which is just not accepting the status quo, not accepting the way things are, and having that energy and that passion to do exactly what Sarah just said, which is to not wait for the court decision, to not wait for the bill to pass, to do something, to say something, to stand up. And these kids did that, right?
It's that Allen Ginsberg quote about the Stonewall, right? They've lost that wounded look, right?
Yeah.
This was not because Judy Garland died. No one was sad here. They were fucking angry.
Yes. And they people had died, right? They'd had friends die. That was a part of, they'd have, like you said, the people that were there were all of these communities, were the street queens, were the sex workers. They had known folks that had died, right? And this was what it, this was enough for them.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts there? Because I do want to jump back to what Sarah said about sort of finding other ways in, but anything about who these folks were and the fact that like their youth and their energy, I think probably had a lot to do with why things played out that way.
I mean, I think it bears as a good segue. Perhaps because Sarah is mentioning the very important power dynamic, and the people who are at Stonewall are exactly the kind of marginalized and oppressed communities who were intimately familiar with the power structures that worked directly against them. And so, to return to Sarah's point, to what great benefit is it if all of our gains are on the backs of Mother May I? That doesn't change any power dynamic.
Yeah.
And so the legal aspect is super important, but so too is the balance of power, is knowing where this permission is coming from and being granted.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to note too. It's very easy for those of us, and I will say us, I mean, I'm a person of color, but in a lot of ways, I have been very lucky that I have a lot of other avenues into privilege. And so I will say us when I say those of us who feel like we can afford a lot of times to take the safe way, to take the long way, to take the proper way into change. It can be very easy for us to want to do that, to want to wait for the courts to approve marriage equality, to want to wait for Congress to pass the the Equal Rights Act, that can and we can get results, right? We have gotten results, but it is in the last few years I have so deeply connected both with the queer community and with my sort of identity as a person of color, and sort of my connection with that has been both voluntary and involuntary, which is sort of unfortunate. But anyway, it is so easy to forget that not everybody can afford to wait, that not everybody can afford to do it the right way, that not everybody has, 8 years, 4 years, 12 years till we get to restructure the US government, till we get to restructure parliament, till we get to do what we need to do to finally, take that route. And it can be scary, but yeah, this is another part of how we make gains. Yeah, the Stonewall riot, the demonstrations, making Pride more of a march, of a demonstration, of a protest. And I don't want to take away from the joy of the event, because there is also something to be said for the fact that people need hope, and they need excitement, and they need a time and a place to celebrate. But, ¿por qué no los dos? We can do both. Thoughts, feelings about that? So, please, jump in. Sarah, did you have something? Sorry.
Well, yeah. Never mind.
That's okay. Fine. And if you we can jump back to this if we need to. If things come up as we sort of press forward. So that's where we came from, right? And we saw the ripples of that, like I said, almost immediately. Within months, activist organizations had formed. Things began to change on sort of both sides. Both sides being the slow legal path and the demonstration, riot, protest path, right? We saw a lot more of both things in then the rest of 1969 and in the early 70s, all throughout the 70s. And things continued to grow into then what we have 50 years later, Pride today. Stonewall was named a national, what's the actual designation? National Monument Site, administered by the National Park Service by the Obama administration in 2016. The bar itself is still privately owned, but it is technically now in parkland, and is a federally protected and recognized site, which is sort of amazing. It only took 47 years, but it's fine. And the Stonewall is still very much the center of the queer community in the Village. It's still packed all the time. As much as I would love to go and sort of pay my respects and celebrate at that site tomorrow, like, I don't think I'll be able to get within 100 yards of that place tomorrow for the crowds. It is a very significant place for the queer community here in New York, and for anyone who comes to visit it and sort of has an interest in exploring these places. And it is very much a symbol that maybe has been somewhat forgotten in a lot of ways over the last 50 years, but still stands and has been federally recognized. And so that sort of takes us then to Pride today and what it is, how we still can, if we look real hard, see the influences of Stonewall 50 years ago, how it's changed for the better and for the worse. We have a lot to talk about and have already touched on the reasons that, Pride has moved away from what it once was, but there are good things too that I think we can talk about. So, I don't know, anybody, thoughts on Pride today, its connection to 50 years ago, its lack of connection to 50 years ago, where are we? Where are we when we talk about Pride, when we have these celebrations now this whole month, when we have these days that are filled with marches, parades, whatever you want to call them? I guess my question, I know it's a vague question, but it's a big question, right? Like, okay, so let's start here then. This question that I asked at the top, the three-ish things that you associated with Pride that first time. What are they now? What is Pride to you in 1 to 3 things now?
I think it is, for me, advocacy.
Great.
Tiring. It's
Yeah.
just it's a day. It's a thing you do, and good things are tiring, but it does exhaust me,
Yeah,
like
no,
physically and emotionally.
Oh my god.
And the final thing is big.
Sorry?
Big.
Big. Yeah.
For the size of the individual events, right? It is happening all over in different places, and big can also mean unfocused, and I think that's sort of one of the dangers that Pride events currently face is losing focus, which I is sort of the point of this brunch is to like refocus the talk about what it is. Especially it raised my blood pressure so much that someone shared on Twitter that article, in New York Times, Inspector Pine, one of the police officers at Stonewall, right,
Oh my God.
saying if it benefited the gays, I'm glad. Like how is
that interview was taken in 1972, right?
it's but it does go back to the hegemony trying to subsume its own resistance. If the police can take pride as like you're welcome,
yeah,
then we need to refocus the discourse surrounding pride and remind them to fuck off.
yeah. Before the next person, I have also asked, and if you aren't watching the chat, if you want to put your 3 things about what Pride is today, please let me know. So I'm going to read a couple of them that we've gotten so far. Soul Bear RPG says that Pride is love, remembrance, and advocacy. And, I'm going to butcher your name, Thurtav says Pride is love, advocacy, and pride in who you are. And Hats, Cats, and Clerics, I'm obsessed with that, says that pride is community, visibility, and acceptance. I love all of those things. I think they're all important. Who of us would like to give your 3 things? And we are going to take a quick little break once we've done these. We'll take just a brief little break, and then we'll come back and talk more about this. But I want to get everybody's 3 things in first.
I guess I can go next.
Sure.
So I still do want to kind of emphasize the diversity because as we've said before, Stonewall, the riots were a diverse crowd, and both of the prides that I have been to thus far have also been very diverse. And I think that's good. We need to focus on that. We need to emphasize it. We need to keep pushing it. And the other thing I wanted to point out, so maybe I only have 2, is necessary, because problematic as it may be, pride is still a good thing. It lets the hegemony, as we've said before, not try and forget about us. It reminds them that we are still here. We still need, we are not going anywhere. We need to be considered. And, again, problematic as it may be, maybe we've lost our way a little bit, but I still think that pride is overall a good thing, and it is overall necessary.
Absolutely.
And I cannot think of a third one. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think that's great. I think those are both super important. And yes, like I mentioned, I only recently have sort of been reminded of the importance of doing things both ways. But I will never let go of the importance of celebrating things, problematic as they may be. Like you said, it's very important. Hope, celebration, joy has to be a part of our community because it's exhausting, because we'll never make it if we don't allow ourselves some joy and some celebration and some acknowledgement of, things are not nearly where we would like them or where they should be, but we do get things, we have accomplished things, and that's important. Corey, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I'm going to read, we got a new one in before Corey goes. MK Hansen, oh, hi, love, says for her pride is courage, advocacy, and community. I love courage. I think that's so important. I love that a lot. Okay, go ahead, Corey.
Yeah. So the three things I thought of is after hearing everyone's previous ones, I realized that anxiety is still a
Yeah,
big thing
sure.
for myself. I just because of all that it means and um, trying to understand that and represent that and making sure that we have space for all the diverse groups. I also think that Pride for me now is a lot about learning
Mm,
and education and knowledge sharing. Um, I think back to what we did at work. Um, since we've been chatting so much about Pride, we talked to the entire company about the genderbread person, which was really cool. And I think that stems a bit from what we've been getting out of Pride and goes all the way back to Stonewall.
mm.
And then the third thing that I think of within sort of a Canadian context is I've been
Yeah.
seeing that Pride has become queer history has become a part of reconciliation within Canada, which has been,
Mm.
I think, really important and something that um, will continue to be important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah. So for me, I too think actually that anxiety is still also part of it for me, but in a very different way. 3 years ago, my first Pride was an anxiety-filled event because I wasn't comfortable being there and being seen there and being out and proud. And now it's actually because my poor therapist has heard so much about this in the last few weeks. Uh, I, I, I worry so much that I'm doing Pride wrong, which is an insane thing to say, right? But I know I'm not the only one who sometimes feels that way. Because all of this stuff is important and because we are informed and educated enough to know that we have perhaps veered from where we once were and where this was originally, and so I have this desire to do it right, which is
Mhm.
crazy. Hey, hey, thanks for rating Pride Ceratops. We're so happy to have you all. Um, yeah, so that is my new anxiety about Pride. I will also say that I now guess I understand the over the top, and so for me it is truly again a celebration,
Mhm.
um, and it is also, this is sort of a silly thing to say, that one of my words for pride is pride, but I understand what that means for me now in a way that I didn't 3 years ago, and in more than just sort of a platitude way, I can sort of take that in as a part of my celebration in June.
Yeah, the snide homophobic argument of like, how if you're born this way, how can you be proud of it?
Yeah.
It's like, well, because of you, asshole.
Yes, exactly. Oh my god, what a delightful thing to go to our break on. Because of you, asshole. Okay, a couple of things before we go to our very quick break. First of all, thank you all for joining us. Pride Ceratops, once again, thank you for rating. Please hang out. I know you folks just got here and we're going on a break, but hang out. We're going to be back. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat while we're on break as best I can. If you all have questions or thoughts or things you want us to discuss, I've got a few things that we are definitely going to touch on in terms of where Pride is now and where it came from. But if you all have stuff you want us to talk about, please put it in the chat. We will do our best to get to it. If those of you who joined us want to put in 1 to 3 things that Pride means to you, I will happily read those. I'm looking at this. My camera's here. I will happily read those out when we get back. We've got about 50 minutes before we are scheduled to be done. This break will be somewhere 5 to 10 minutes. We'll be back soon. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll be back very shortly. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Ooh, there we go. Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for hanging out and sticking around during the break. We are back just really quickly. For anybody joining us lately, either right before or right after the break, just want to go over a few of the housekeeping things again. First of all, welcome to Variant Role's Pride Brunch, final Pride Brunch of the season. Thank you so very much for being here. If the quick housekeeping things, Variant Roles, in addition to these awesome opportunities for queer folks to get together and talk about our community and our history and pride, we also occasionally stream some tabletop games, I guess. We have a bunch of RPG content every week. We do D&D 5e, we do Fate, we do Cypher System, we do all kinds of stuff. So if you are interested in any of that and haven't already, click the little heart at the top of the screen to follow the channel so you know when we are live. Also this month, we got 2 days left, including today, for our fundraiser for Trans Lifeline. We've been raising money for them all month, so any bits, any cheers, or any direct donations that you would like to give to us and through us to Trans Lifeline are super appreciated. They're an amazing organization. There's a link just below the video screen. It is hard to miss because it is rainbow bright, where you can click to get more information about donating to Trans Lifeline. We've been doing really well this month, and we want to finish off today and tomorrow with a bang. So thank you for that. Okay. Let's hop back into the conversation. So, I had some... Oh, yes, there's a link in the chat. Thank you, Corey. To get more information about Trans Lifeline as well. A link to their website. So we've talked about the history. We've talked a little bit about where we are now. We've talked about, how we all perceive and feel about Pride. And Emma in the chat brought up a really great question that I want to sort of go to next, which is how... So we've all established that it is incredibly important for us to spread this knowledge that we have talked about today, to make sure that people... queer folks in particular, but frankly, the heteros can get it too, about the history, the education about queer history, and about just queer issues in general. And so Emma's question was, how can we, as a community, be better about helping that education along, about educating our siblings in the community? How do we do that, right? So yeah, thoughts? There was some really great conversation about it in the chat and the importance of it, but I actually would love to talk a little bit about sort of some actual concrete ideas and solutions if anybody has them. Which is a big question, I know. I realize. It's a hard thing, people were talking about, the importance of things like, how in many school systems, public school systems now, Black history has sort of become a thing that is on the curriculum. And in some places it is done better than others, but it's a thing that is often on curricula now. And so, like we said with activism, like, that is one avenue in, getting queer history to be a part of a curriculum. It's a little harder because our month is not during the generally accepted school year, but it is what it is. But there was also some comments about how, we have to educate each other. We have to, not word of mouth, because that's sort of not how things work in 2019 tech era, but like, we keep our own histories, we keep our own stories, we educate our own. And I think there's an important balance there. So how do we help that? How do we educate others? How do we highlight the importance of our history to others?
I think in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf writes about the importance of having the space to create. In the context of the feminist and proto-feminist movement, it was about literally reclaiming a space in which that kind of education, transmission, and creation can happen. And I think that's at least one of the areas that the queer community can, and I think largely does, foster. I mean, what is Variant Roles if not a space that is open and inclusive to queer people, to live their truths and speak them and create with them. Our history is not just a recitation of facts. It is emotional and practical lives being played out.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, there is definitely something to be said for just creating spaces in which people feel safe to talk about this history, right? Like that is a hugely important thing. What else? What other things can we do? So we've created these spaces now. How do you know? I don't want to mischaracterize the younger generation in an unfair way, but even for me, as an elder millennial, it can be difficult sometimes. And now that I'm in it, it's hard for me to remember that I ever felt this way. But it can be difficult the further and further removed we get from June 1969 to feel like it's of imminent importance, right? To feel like that history is imminently important. And like I said, once I sort of got into the history and started learning more, it very quickly became clear. But it was that sort of hook, it was that start, right, that can be sort of difficult. There's so much that we have to know, that we feel like we have to do, that we have to be a part of. And there's so much going on now, right, in the last 5-10 years. How do we also prioritize and get particularly younger and younger members of our community to prioritize what happened 50 years ago?
One thing that I found that has worked as far as getting the conversation rolling in like a really concrete way is making sure that you're using your pronouns and introducing yourself with your pronouns, because I found that especially in like my work setting, a lot of people don't know why you would say your pronouns, and it started a lot of discussions around that, which I think is great. And that is, I found a good first step, that you can start with that and it opens up the whole door to whichever parts of queer history that you want to talk about, to sort of explain the importance of why we come back to that. And since they're all connected, I find that that's been a good concrete way to contribute a bit to that and contribute a bit to the education aspect of it.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's the little things that we can do to just bring up any part of the conversation. And then we, as folks who we, the four of us, we, those of you who are here with us in chat today, have taken the time to do a little bit more, to learn a little bit more, can then steer that conversation once it's been started. I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Thoughts, Sarah? Yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what Colin said about creating spaces, we kind of have a space already, right? And that being Pride.
Sure.
And so I've only been to 2 Prides. I can't say that this is universal, but in my experience, when I went to Buffalo Pride, they had no history whatsoever, at least that I could find. And then at Corning, a couple weeks ago, they had like a table under a booth that was unmanned that had a timeline on it, and that was it. And I think, especially seeing as how Pride is an event that draws people in from even outside the queer community. I think that's a good way that we can start putting this out there and getting people aware of where it comes from and why it's important to remember where it comes from, at the risk of, kind of taking the obvious answer, but
no,
I still think it's important.
It is absolutely important. It's a good point. Again, it's easier, I think, for us here in New York because the march ends at Stonewall for all intents and purposes. So it's hard to avoid the fact that place is a part of what we're doing here. I'm curious, Corey and Colin, what have your experiences at Pride been in terms of the visibility of history as part of the event, if there was any?
Yeah. One thing that I think about when asked that question is, we did our flag raising ceremony, and that was a very I guess soulful event.
Sure.
In how people were chatting about it. And there was a lot of great speeches. We didn't have that so much at the parade itself. But I think in that event in particular, that's when some of the visibility as far as Stonewall came up and started to chat about that. And yeah, that's
okay.
That's where I'll end that thought.
Yeah. Colin.
My involvement with the Boston Pride was not as hands-on as I would have liked, because I was
You were busy
tending to a bar. Yeah. Nonetheless, it had a very strong sort of now element to it. It did not really reference Stonewall. It did not seem to reference with any specificity the history of Pride. But I will say that the Boston Pride, it tended to be very advocacy focused. I was going to school at a predominantly gay university, like renowned for how queer it is. Like when you for orientation, they tell you gay by May or your money back.
Oh,
yeah, my parents were thrilled.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But they're also very politically active. Right next to the Boston Commons, protests and activities generally congregated around there. So points for that, even if it's losing points for a sense of history, the sort of ever-present now. Everything is now, and that'll keep you moving, but don't forget what has happened.
Yeah. So I think then what we're finding, and I will say, I made the point that here in New York, the march ends at Stonewall, so it's sort of unavoidable. That said, there isn't certainly a lot of active efforts, a little bit more this year, but in general, there's not a lot of active effort to connect with that history on an educational level. So it sounds like a very sort of concrete way that we all can be a part of queer education is to do whatever it is that we can to bring some of that history and that education into Pride events in our cities. All of us can contact depending on the size of the organization in wherever it is that you live, contact your march organizers or contact LGBTQIA+ organizations that are going to be a part of the march or a part of any of the events, and just ask the question, are there educational events? Is there information available? Is there stuff about the history of where this came from? And if they say no, then you can be that person to either say, maybe there should be, could you think about that? Or to say, cool, then can I do that? Can I be a part of making that happen then? And making it happen. And don't feel like you have to know everything, right? You can learn through the process as well. What's important is that we create spaces and forums like this one, and create booths at the march and create, things at events where people can come and have conversations and ask questions. You don't have to know everything, even if you're the person who's sort of leading the charge to add that as a part of the events. I think that's great. Yeah. Cool. Anything else about how we can participate in education, how we can prioritize education about queer history in general, in Pride, in whatever?
I think the flip side is resisting the pernicious revision of our histories. I mentioned this New York Times article because it really got my blood going to read that. And to read such open attempt at revising. There was also an article about an incident that happened at the Stonewall recently, which a trans woman of color wanted to speak and was shouted down by some white gays. And those are precisely the kinds of things which will erode our sense of history. Our sense of history is our sense of community, and they go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
So those elements which attempt to undermine or undercut either our sense of community or our sense of history are things which we need to actively resist.
Yeah, definitely. Correct
people when they're wrong, right? Correct people when they are acting non-inclusively.
Yeah.
That's how you start. First thing you do when you're trying to educate is cut the bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly those of us who have any measure of privilege and safety step up and correct those things, particularly for those who cannot, who do not feel safe doing so, who do not have that privilege to do so. It is so important for cis folks to speak up and correct on behalf of trans folks. It is so important for white folks to speak up on behalf and correct on behalf of folks of color. It can be scary, but my guess is it's way less scary for me as a cis person to correct somebody about pronouns than it might be for a trans person who's just come out. It's way less scary for a white person to correct somebody on the pronouns of a trans person of color than it would be for that black person, right? So yeah, that's a really good point too. Education can be in small ways and correcting in correcting errors. Absolutely.
One thing that were you done with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Just wanted to check.
I appreciate it.
One thing that I've been struggling to figure out how to put this into words, so I'll try carefully. But something that I saw at this Pride was I found that within sort of like the international Canadian space, we've been coming back a little bit to Stonewall and connecting our community a bit with that. And it's been done in a way where we've been, I find, drawing some parallels, especially within our Indigenous and Two-Spirited cultures. That's been something that, there's analogies and similar stories that have gone on. So I found that bringing the communities together and sort of like sharing the stories that way has almost been one way to just increase the amount of things that are being shared and the amount of stories that people can learn from. And I think that's been really great. And I think as the future goes on, we'll see hopefully a lot more of that and get to see some really cool things there.
Definitely. Yeah. Sarah, anything? Sorry, before I ramble some more.
No, I think everything was pretty well covered.
Yeah. I think in talking about that, I do think I want to make the point again that we all have a responsibility to this history and to education. But that can mean different things for different people, right? People will have access to different resources, will have a feeling of different abilities to speak up and do things. And the best we can do is whatever it is we feel that we're able to do. But we all should try and do something, right? Because that little tiny something that any one of us feels that we can do might spark someone who's in a position to do much more. And again, I've seen a lot of really cool things in the chat about folks. Hats, Cats, and Clerics talks about having a couple of queer children's books that they keep in their classroom. Queer literature accessible to people of different ages in schools would be beneficial, they think, which is absolutely true. And it's about those little things, right? It's about finding ways. If we can get them into classrooms, fantastic. But any little thing that we can do is important. Cool. Chat, again, we've got about, 25 minutes left in our brunch. So if you have things that you would like to see us discuss, please put it in the chat. But I'm going to head back to my little notepad over here, which I can't find because I have too many damn tabs open. Great. So I want to talk a little bit about excuse me. I want to talk a little bit about Pride now. We sort of put a pin in this and we've hopped around it a little ways. I want to talk about, since we're talking about ways that we can change things, I want to talk about some things that Sarah mentioned, which is Pride is important despite its problematicness, which is not a word. And having the visibility of major corporations is important despite their uber problematicness, which is a word. It's not. How do you all feel about that balance? How do reconcile with that balance, and how do we? I'm gonna say something that you all can absolutely disagree with, and chat, you can absolutely disagree with as well. I have a hard time with folks who want to clear Pride of all sort of outside corporate involvement. And I understand that impulse. I really do. But for me, I cannot disregard the value that those problematic elements bring. Just like we can't disregard the value of what the Mafia did for queer bars and queer spaces in the 1960s and 70s. So how do we have that conversation? How do we reconcile that really difficult sort of butting of heads of priorities? How do we deal with that?
I think one of the things that did I cut someone off?
No, please go ahead, Sarah.
No, it's just briefing.
One of the things that is really important to keep in mind, because I definitely understand, I've seen all this stuff, like no corporations at Pride, no cops at Pride, and I get it. I absolutely get it. But at the same time, one of the most powerful ways to reduce the amount by which you are marginalized by society is to allow yourself to be normalized. Mm-hmm. And the way that you do that is by getting the people who have power in your society, so corporations, to acknowledge you. You don't have to blindly say, well, Budweiser put out a bunch of these, pride flag cups, so we can't say anything bad about Budweiser.
Right.
But it is still important to realize that, two people who are not in the queer community, they're going to look at that and they're going to see, they might look at that and say, well, I don't know what that flag is. I should look that up. And then they educate themselves to the fact that, asexuality, for example, is something that exists and that there's a community for that. And it doesn't allow the how am I trying to say this? The stand.
I know what you're getting at, and I'm also having trouble sort of.
Yeah, it doesn't allow the majority to control the conversation.
Sure.
In saying, well, being gay is just this weird, abnormal thing that these people do off in their own stuff. No, we're a part of society, and it's just normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was really well spoken.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a seat at the table, right, under capitalism means participating in it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But it isn't a binary. It
Sure.
isn't a strict opt-in, opt-out. To return again to Terry Eagleton, there is an absolute value in knowing what you are consuming that has been handed to you from the hegemony, right? Mm-hmm. When you go home and you turn on the TV, you can mindlessly watch TV, passively intake what's happening, and that is a very human impulse. But there's absolute value to actively and skeptically regarding it, to actively engage with it. You're still watching the same show in this analogy, right? So to speak more concretely, when Pepsi comes and wants to contribute to Pride, and it's very clear what their motives are,
sure,
there's absolute value to recognizing, identifying those motives. It doesn't mean you don't have to take their money.
Yeah.
Because it's money,
yeah.
right? It's sponsorship, it's visibility.
Yeah.
And truly, I think the onus is on us as a community to stay active, to actively participate in these outside corporate intrusions rather than let them happen to our community. And it's a fine line. It's a hard line to walk, but it is one that we absolutely have to if we want to maintain a sense of integrity.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, Jess, why?
Yeah, there's a couple of comments in the chat that I want to sort of highlight in this conversation. Hats, Cats, and Clerics has a quote that says, "There is no ethical consumption under capitalism," which, again, that's a whole other brunch. But yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you all have been speaking to, which is that it doesn't seem productive to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, I do think, back to Sarah's point from much earlier, I do think there is a conversation to be had about conversations who contribute and put out flags and then turn around and actively work against our interests. I think that is perhaps a somewhat different conversation that should be had. But, you know, normalizing visibility, that's all important. It's the other night, during the Democratic debates, the first Democratic debate, those of you who didn't watch and somehow have been blissfully unaware of some of the things that went on, 3 of the candidates spoke sort of at length in Spanish. And there have been a lot of memes and takedowns and funny things on the social medias about how pandery it was and how awkward it was and how this and that. And I guess maybe so. But for me, as a Latinx person in the United States whose parents came from Mexico, I don't care if they were pandering. 3 people who are running for president of the United States thought it would help them get votes to speak in another language that is not English on national TV during a debate. Pander all you want. Like, that is a thing for me that made me feel a lot of things, and most of them were quite good, right? And that is very much the same thing that's happening here. You know, a major beer company, let's go with Budweiser again, right? That, like, their sort of stereotypical demographic is, like, very heterosexual white bros, right? Put some flags, some pride flags on their shit. Are they pandering to get money from the gay community? Absolutely. Do I care? Maybe not so much. They think that doing that is the right move. That's crazy. They would not have done that 30 years ago at Pride, right? Absolutely not. Do they still get pushback?
10 years ago.
10 years ago, sure. Do they still get pushback from it? Absolutely. Do they do a calculus that says the gains are better than the pushback? Absolutely, which says a lot about where things are right now, right? And I understand that there are problems with that. I understand that it can be problematic, but oh my God, what a thing to celebrate that we are in a place where these corporations did that calculus and said we're worth it.
We don't have to say Budweiser, like, gays only drink Budweiser now. Like,
God,
we don't
no.
have to.
Yeah.
Like, we're not
Please,
buying.
have you met us? We've got better taste. Sorry, Budweiser.
Yes.
We don't need to, like, suddenly, like, become the Budweiser people, right? But we can absolutely point to Budweiser and say, look, they think we have value on a social stage, right?
Yeah.
There is a cold calculus they've made that includes us.
Mm-hmm.
So embrace that for what it is, for the data that it is, for the small victory it may represent.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not as though Budweiser is going to going balls to the wall in advocacy for gay rights. They're not sending lobbyists to Washington for us, but there is some value that has been calculated that we can look to as an evidence.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there anything else that we can talk about that we can say, that we can use to help us have that conversation with those in the community who disagree with us, that aren't willing to compromise their sterling morals? I don't mean to sound like I'm shitting on them, but it's hard for me because I that is a world that we don't live in where we can afford that. So it's hard for me to sort of have that conversation. Is there anything else? This is all great stuff, and this is all very useful things to try and have that conversation. But are there any other thoughts about how we speak to those people, how we have conversations with those folks?
I feel like I've been talking a lot.
It's okay.
So
Corey or Sarah, anything? No is okay. Also, I know it's a bit of a rehash of what we've just been talking about, but I sort of wanted to bring it back to, you know, how we engage with that, because it is perhaps a minority, but as so often is the case, a fairly vocal and loud minority.
Yeah. I think it's tough because when you're chatting about that, it's about sort of developing and crafting the larger narrative. And on an individual level, you know, by definition, you don't get to control the larger narrative. That's just, you know, it's the collective rather than the individual. So that's
Sure.
It's tough. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I don't either.
And I think it's also important to remember that a lot of times an attitude that, you know, kind of pushes back against a hard line, no corporations kind of thing, does in some way come from a place of privilege, right?
Well, yes, this was what I was about to get to. Good point. Keep going.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, like, it, you know, so this is my mind is more on I see a lot, and I saw it again a lot this year, is no cops at Pride as opposed to corporations. But, you know, it's a lot easier for me as someone who is white, who is cis passing, who probably is not going to get harassed a lot by the cops, as opposed to a non-passing, you know, trans person of color who is going to. And it's important to understand that that's where that attitude is coming from, and to not put it down, but to instead take it and say, okay, we're going to, you know, appreciate the fact that the police are on our side, at least nominally, now, as opposed to what they were before, but we still need to hold them accountable.
Sure.
And we still need to make sure that we use, you know, we don't let them, you know, I don't know what adjective you're going to put in front of the wash, but, you know, get rid of their own culpability in our marginalization.
Sure.
I'm going to take a drink of water.
Looping this back to Stonewall, what I talked about earlier, where Stonewall was not a moment in which things went out of control.
Right.
It was a moment in which control shifted. Embracing that as something of an answer when dealing with these corporate interests. To say no corporate interest is not productive.
Right.
But you can say how. You can, if the hard line is no corporate interest, what's the compromise?
Sure.
Dictate the terms to that corporate interest. If you want to be at Pride, here's where your money has to go. Here's where you have to donate some of those proceeds. If you're going to use our community,
you can't donate those proceeds.
Exactly. My father is also a lawyer, and he has a little bit of wisdom. His little bit of wisdom on settlements is a good settlement is when both sides leave unhappy, because it means that both sides gave something up.
Sure.
And so I think the queer community can absolutely take the reins and try to dictate the terms on which these outside influences come. It is naive to say no cops at Pride, but we could set up an oversight community, right? Like a queer oversight community, and their only job would be to handle the complaints and the performance and hold accountable those cops who are at Pride. So I think those kinds of active involvement are the way forward, rather than a blanket rejection.
Yeah.
I think I myself, speaking subjectively as opinion, am more on the side of, you know, get as much as you can. You're sort of picking your poisons in a sense. So if corporations or whatever are going to give an inch, I fully support take the mile instead.
Bleed them.
Yeah. And if there are groups that are, you know, not following through on the representation that they're trying to benefit from, I totally agree that you should drag their names and demand that they step up and give what should be expected and, you know, is deserved for their involvement and what they're actually going to contribute.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all good. It's all good ways to have this conversation. It's all ways to try and find a middle ground with those who very much want Pride to be cop and corporation free. I do one more time, because I was thinking something very similar when Sarah said it. Just recognize, particularly, I have an easier time sort of equating this to the no cops at Pride than the no corporations at Pride. But in any event, I think the ability to say we can't have no cops at Pride, and that sort of position a little bit comes out of a place that, you know, like she said, of privilege, and I do very much understand that for people in marginalized communities who have been targeted by police, particularly in a place where there is a very visible history of problematic policing, let's say, like in New York City, I understand someone from a community that has been targeted by the police seeing them there and just feeling like they've been punched in the gut, that they one day can do something really horrible and the next day get to march in the parade or even just to work at the parade. I can see that being really difficult, and I can see that I don't have the point of view that they do about it. And I think your points about accountability, about dictating the terms of their presence, I feel like that is a really smart way, and perhaps a difficult way, but a smart way to sort of address those concerns. You know, in a big city like New York, it's sort of, you know, the alternative to no cops at Pride is sort of somewhat frightening to think about to me. Like, there's just so many people, and to have nobody sort of doing crowd control in an official capacity feels somewhat frightening to me.
Yeah, I think there is part of it where, as well, making sure to understand that the people who have been hurt in those through those channels also have a space where they're not frightened by the presence of cops at Pride.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, and it's a particularly difficult conversation within our own community, but it's an important one. So I encourage you all to, if you are able, to do it, to have it, to talk about it. Cool. We've got about 6 minutes before our scheduled ending time. So last thoughts, things that you haven't gotten a chance that you want to say, snide remarks and criticisms of me, of Pride, of whatever. We'll go around and do like an outro introduction again, where you can follow us on social media, all that. But anything else we should address, we want to say in these last few minutes? Anybody?
I think if you were watching and you felt like we could improve upon anything or find better ways to talk about it, please engage with us through Twitter, through chat. Let us know, because we're always learning. We can always do better and understand each other better. So I really want to encourage that engagement if you are comfortable and willing to.
Yes, absolutely. And I a lot of our rainbow motifs may go away from the Variant Roles channel as the year moves on. But all of these people that you've seen today, all of the people that you've seen on every Pride Brunch, just about everybody that I have ever engaged with on this channel is here to have those conversations, to continue to grow in that way. And I hope that everybody watching today can find a home for that sort of conversation, for that discussion here at Variant Roles. And I will say, as someone who's on the creative council for the channel, it is definitely something that is written into our code of conduct that we sort of screen for as best we can. as we invite new folks to the community. So yes, we do our best to, thank you, Corey, to make this a place that you can engage with all of us at all times. Okay, who else? Who wants to say other things? Oh my goodness, thank you for these exciting cheers and emotes. I don't understand Twitch, so I don't know what's going on. Who's next?
So on a personal level, I really want to thank everyone here for being part of this discussion and having me on here for this discussion, and being part of that active cultivation of space. The takeaway, one of the takeaways that I'm carrying with me out of this conversation is the idea that we are not done, that we often look at these social issues and the queer community as this kind of architecture, as though there's a house that we're building. And the truth is, we're not ever going to be done with that house. There's always going to be work to be done. And that is not something we should consider as a negative, because that active involvement is what this community is about. To say that we are actively maintaining the community is to say that we are actively involved with the community. And if we are not actively involved, someone else will be. And that is where the pernicious influences undoubtedly insert themselves. So that's my takeaway, is I'm really glad we're never going to be done, because I'm always going to have something to do.
Absolutely. Sarah, anything last thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to echo Colin's sentiment about thank you for bringing me on and letting me talk with you guys, because I know I'm not as in this community, and I speak of, when I say community, I mean variant roles,
Sure.
as you guys are. So I very much appreciate you guys having me on. This was a great time, and I think it is very much important to have that takeaway of, it's easy to imagine that we've come a long way since 1969, but we haven't really. And all the gains that we have made are threatened. And they will continue to be threatened. And we need to keep that in mind, because, as Colin said, we have a long way to go. So we need to be more conscious than we have been. And I include myself in that. I knew almost nothing about Stonewall before this. So we need to be conscious of that, as I've said already, but now I'm rambling.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Quite all right.
Happy to have you. Yeah, for me, I mean, the only thing I want to say their names again: Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Zazu Nova, Storm de Laverie, and so many others. We've made strides. It is threatened. The way forward is intersectionality. The way forward is no longer forgetting that trans women of color were the reason that we have pride. Never again meeting a queer person of a reasonable age who has never heard the name Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera. We have to all be a unified community. We all have different needs. There are distinctions and differences, but intersectionality among our community is our way forward. And knowing this history and knowing who was there and what they did is a big part of that. So go forth and say those names today and tomorrow and always. Say those names to people you meet, to people who have questions. If you remember nothing else, remember those names. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. This has been really amazing. I do want to go around now because, as Corey said, we want you to engage with us, have conversations with us. We are all active on social media in varying degrees and levels. So we're going to go around, say our names one more time, share whatever, as much or as little social media information of yours as you are comfortable with. Totally fine. You can find all of us around here on Variant Roles to some degree or another. We are all now in the Discord, so at the very least you can find us there. So yeah, let's go around. We'll go in reverse order from where we started. So Corey, we'll start with you.
Yeah, my name is Corey Hickson. I'm on Twitter at the same spot. I was really glad to participate in this and to join all of you. I want really quickly to give a shout out to Emma,
Yes.
Emma Hansen,
Thank you. Yes.
who has done so much work in organizing for all of these things in Pride Month. It was just phenomenal, and it was really a keystone in getting a lot of these things organized. I, for Pride, released a collection of games called the Pride
Oh
Collection.
yeah.
Any proceeds from, or all proceeds rather, from this game are going to be added to the Variant Roles Trans Lifeline contribution. I think we're getting pretty close to about $100 on that, which I'm excited about. And furthermore, if you don't want that, but you have contributed to any queer charities, or you're thinking about contributing to queer charities, just do it, and I will flat out just give you a copy of the game for free, because the point of it is to get involved, put some dollars where you can. If not, find ways to signal boost or other ways that you can contribute. That's totally great too. And lastly, tonight we've got Invisible Sun on the channel,
Yeah.
which I wanted to mention because I'm partaking in that with
Oh.
the wonderful Alice, who is a big sword lesbian, and I love her.
You know I'm gonna do that plug. You know I'm gonna get there. I love it. I love it. I love it. Excellent. I've lost the screen. Let's go to Colin.
Hi, I'm Colin Volcanet. I am one half of the Phantom Roll Booth. It's a Twitch channel, not unlike Variant Roles. You can find me on Twitter at ColinItLikeIC. This is going to be the first time I've officially announced it. If I can hit my writing deadlines, at least, I will be included in Uncaged Anthology 2.
Yay!
That is
Hit those
like
deadlines.
fingers crossed. Yeah, well, it's like tomorrow, so
Oh my
we'll
God.
see. This is who I am as a person. Additionally, I'd like to plug my friend Bag of Snails. He wrote the Chroma Sorcerer for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It should be on the DMs Guild, and all the proceeds from those sales go to the Trevor Project. So Bag of Snails is great. He's also currently fundraising to help his poor puppy get some medical care. But check out the Chroma Sorcerer and support that.
Fantastic. Sarah.
So my name is Sarah Files. I am a bit less active in the community than you guys are, but I do have a Twitter. And so if you'd like to talk to me there, please do. I would be happy to speak with you. That's at Sarah J, just the letter 6492. And I think that's about all I have because I don't really have anything to plug.
That's all right. We are happy to have you, and we hope we'll see you around the channel. And once again, I am Eugenio. You can follow me on Twitter at DMJazzyHands. I am part of the Creative Council here at Variant Roles. I've got a bunch of streams. I have a podcast that's about to hit its 2-year anniversary next week, in a week and a half. I don't know, whenever it is. But all of that information is in and around my Twitter, so you can find it there. Since we're sort of wrapping up Pride Month, the one thing that I do want to mention that I'm going to be doing tomorrow, I will be streaming on Gratuitous RP. I'm their DM for the summer over there. They're a super great bunch, the Half Right Heroes, and we are doing a fundraiser for the Trevor Project. So if you've got leftover dough after donating to Trans Lifeline here on Variant Roles, hop over tomorrow to Gratuitous RP, watch me send the party through some adventures in the city of Waterdeep, and if you are able, donate some money there to the Trevor Project. We have, I believe, hit our fundraising goal of $500 for the month over there, which is super exciting, but we would love to do more. So check us out there. I do want to do some thanks. I know we're a little over time. Thank you all for hanging out, but I really quickly want to do some thanks for the channel. The organizers of sort of all of our Pride events, myself, our Papa Bear Dan, the founder of the channel, Corey, Matt Foreman, and Emma have all been absolutely integral in making sure that this month was as exciting and event-packed as possible. And I have to echo Corey's particular thanks of Emma. She has been incredible in helping us to get all of this stuff happening. So thank you for all of that. Thank you all for being here, for checking out Variant Roles. We're going to be around for a long time with lots of stuff in the future. Later today, it looks like at 6 p.m. tonight, we've got a Ghost of Saltmarsh community game going on. 9 p.m. is Invisible Sun. All kinds of good stuff. This fundraiser for Trans Lifeline is going to go till the end of the day tomorrow. So continue checking out stuff here on the channel. If you haven't hit that follow button, do that. If you are able and want to be a subscriber, want to join our Patreon, patreon.com/variantroles, you can do all of that. and we've got more coming to you today, tomorrow, and going forward. To the four of you, thank you, or to the three of you, there's four with me. Thank you so much for being with me today and for having this conversation. I was, like I said, honored to follow up Emma and Matt's brunches, and I think this one has been really valuable, and that is entirely due to the three of you and your viewpoints and your knowledge and your willingness to have these conversations. So truly my thanks to all of you. I am so happy that this is part of how I get to close out my Pride Month. Thank you all who have stuck around and watched. We appreciate your participation. As we have all said, please reach out to us, have this conversation, continue this conversation. Oh, I just got a text from my dad saying he's proud of me and now I'm crying. I guess they're watching. Damn it, Dad. Thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate everything from all of the us here at Variant Roles. Thank you. Happy Pride. Be safe. Stay hydrated. Have a good time. We will see you later today for Ghosts of Saltmarsh. Goodbye.
Bye.
Oh, no. There we go.